The man Mike Tyson could never escape. Mike Tyson was not just a boxer, he was a storm, a name that terrified champions, shook arenas, and changed boxing forever. Stepping into the ring with him felt like walking straight into danger. But the most haunting part of Tyson's story was never the men he fought under the lights. Because for all the opponents he destroyed, there was one man he could never truly escape. He was there in Tyson's rise. He was there in his pain. In every outburst, every collapse, every dark moment, that shadow seemed to follow him. And the strangest part of all? The harder Tyson tried to outrun him, the deeper that man's grip seemed to become. So who was the one man even Iron Mike could never leave behind? Before the chaos, before the prison time, before the headlines turned dark, Mike Tyson was the most frightening force boxing had ever seen. He exploded onto the scene like a weapon nobody knew how to stop. Trained to destroy, built for pressure, and driven by a hunger that felt almost dangerous, Tyson didn't just beat fighters, he erased them. By the age when most heavyweights were still learning their craft, Tyson had already become the youngest heavyweight champion in history. His speed was unreal, his power looked unnatural, and his presence alone could break a man before the first punch landed. Crowds didn't watch Tyson just to see who would win. They watched to see how quickly the damage would begin. He looked unstoppable, untouchable, almost inhuman. And that is exactly why what came next felt so shocking. Because even a man who seemed invincible was still carrying something far heavier than any belt. But Tyson's story was never only about power. Long before the fame, the fear, and the world titles, there was one man whose presence shaped everything he would become. Cus D'Amato. To the world, Cus was a legendary trainer. To Tyson, he was far more than that. He was a father figure, a teacher, a protector, and in many ways the first person who truly saw greatness inside a lost, angry kid from Brooklyn. When Tyson was still just a troubled teenager full of rage and pain, Cus looked past the violence and saw a future champion. More importantly, he gave Tyson something even rarer: belief. Cus didn't just teach him how to slip punches or knock men out. He taught him how to think, how to control fear, and how to turn pain into power. Under Cus, Tyson wasn't just being trained. He was being rebuilt. And that is what made this bond so powerful. Because from that point on, Tyson was no longer just fighting for himself. He was fighting for the man who created him. And when someone helps build your identity from the ground up, escaping their shadow becomes almost impossible. The reason Mike Tyson could never escape Cus D'Amato was simple. Cus was no longer just a person in his life. He had become the voice inside Tyson's head. Every lesson, every warning, every belief about fear, discipline, and greatness stayed with him long after Cus was gone. Even after Tyson became world champion, he was still chasing the approval of the man who was no longer there to give it. That was the tragedy. Cus had built Tyson into a weapon, but he had also become the emotional center of Tyson's world. And when Cus died in 1985, Tyson lost more than a trainer. He lost the one man who understood how to control the storm inside him. From that moment on, Tyson kept winning in the ring, but outside of it, the cracks began to grow. He still had the power. He still had the belts, but without Cus, Tyson no longer had the same anchor. And maybe that is why he could never escape him, because the greatest version of Mike Tyson had only ever existed when Cus D'Amato was standing beside him. At first, it did not look like anything had changed. Tyson kept winning, kept knocking men out, and kept building the image of an unstoppable champion. To the public, he was still the same terrifying force. But beneath that dominance, something critical was missing. The discipline that Cus had drilled into him, the emotional balance, and the sense of purpose. Those things were starting to slip. And that was where the real turning point began. Without Cus D'Amato, Tyson was no longer surrounded by the same kind of protection. New voices entered his world. Businessmen, handlers, friends, and opportunists all saw something in Tyson, but not always the same thing Cus saw. Cus saw a fighter to be guided. Others saw a superstar to be used. That difference changed everything. As the years moved on, Tyson's life became more chaotic. His training became less focused. His anger became harder to control. The fear he once used as fuel began to work against him, and in many ways, every bad decision that followed seemed to prove the same painful truth. Tyson was still searching for the structure Cus had once given him. He had become the biggest name in boxing. But the man who had taught him how to carry that greatness was gone. And the more Tyson drifted, the more impossible it became to escape the shadow of the one man who had once kept him whole. As Mike Tyson got older, the way he spoke about Cus D'Amato began to reveal just how deep that loss really was. He did not talk about Cus like a former coach. He talked about him like the one man who had given his life direction, purpose, and meaning. In interview after interview, Tyson's voice would change whenever Cus came up, as if he was no longer the feared heavyweight champion, but the young boy who still missed the man who believed in him first. That is what makes this story so powerful. Tyson did not just lose Cus in 1985. In many ways, he kept losing him for the rest of his life. Every success reminded him of who was not there to see it. Every mistake reminded him of the voice he no longer had to guide him. And with time, Tyson seemed to understand a painful truth. All the fame, money, and championships in the world could not replace the one man who had kept his mind stronger than his fists. That realization never really left him. The damage Cus D'Amato left behind was not physical. It was deeper than that. It lived in the silence after the cheers, in the confusion behind Tyson's rage, and in the emptiness that success could never fully cover. Once Cus was gone, Tyson still had the talent to destroy fighters, but he no longer had the same guidance to protect himself from the world around him. And that is where everything began to unravel. The man who once looked unbeatable started to seem vulnerable in ways no opponent could expose. His life outside the ring became louder, messier, and more self-destructive. The discipline faded, the trust disappeared, the anger grew. Tyson was still feared by millions, but inside, he often looked like a man fighting battles no belt could solve. That is why Cus remained impossible to escape. Because his absence shaped Tyson almost as much as his presence once did. And in the end, the greatest enemy Tyson faced was not a boxer at all. It was the void left behind by the man who made him. In the end, Mike Tyson did what almost no fighter in history could ever do. He conquered fear, crushed champions, and turned himself into one of the most terrifying athletes the world had ever seen. But for all his power, all his fame, and all the destruction he caused inside the ring, there was one thing he could never truly defeat: the shadow of Cus D'Amato. That is what makes Tyson's story so tragic and so unforgettable. Because this was never just the story of a boxer who lost a trainer. It was the story of a wounded kid who found a father, built his identity around him, and then spent the rest of his life trying to hold on to something that was already gone. Every triumph carried Cus with it. Every fall exposed how badly Tyson still needed him. And maybe that is the real reason Tyson could never escape him. Not because Cus was haunting him in some dark, mysterious way, but because the best version of Mike Tyson was born in that bond. Once it was broken, Tyson kept fighting the world, while quietly chasing the one man who had once made him feel unstoppable.